Hey guys, tonight, we're diving into a history so incredibly niche, so wonderfully obscure, that by the time we're done, your brain might just decide to pack it in for the night. No alarm necessary. Imagine, if you will, the gentle hum of a distant village, the scent of shea butter mixed with wood smoke on a breeze, and the rhythm of life governed not by clocks, but by seasons and traditions. Now picture yourself standing in a bustling marketplace, perhaps in the ancient Mali Empire, or maybe a lesser-known kingdom along the Niger River. You're observing the lively trade, the vibrant textiles, the rhythmic drumming, and then just as you start to feel comfortable, a sudden commotion. Someone has broken a sacred rule, and the elders are gathering. You might think, oh, a simple fine, a slap on the wrist. But tonight we're going far beyond simple fines. We're exploring the peculiar, often mind-boggling punishments meted out in medieval West Africa. And trust me, some of these make a modern-day parking ticket look like a spa day. You probably won't survive this intellectual journey without at least one existential sigh. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you drift deeper into this historical reverie, you begin to understand that these societies, long before the arrival of colonial powers, possessed complex and nuanced legal systems. They weren't just a free-for-all, quite the opposite. Their laws, often unwritten and passed down through generations, were deeply interwoven with their spiritual beliefs, social structures, and the practical necessities of communal living. You see, unlike the more familiar European systems that often relied on written codes like the Magna Carta or Roman law justice, here was frequently administered through oral traditions, proverbs, and the collective wisdom of elders. Think of it less like a courtroom with dusty law books, and more like a community forum where everyone had a vested interest in maintaining harmony. One mainstream historical fact to grasp right away is that many West African societies before the 15th century were highly organized with sophisticated governance structures. We're not talking about scattered, disorganized tribes, but powerful empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, each with their own established hierarchies and mechanisms for social control. Their legal frameworks were designed to uphold social order, resolve disputes, and maintain the delicate balance that allowed these complex societies to thrive. You might imagine that in a world without police forces as we know them, or dedicated prisons, maintaining peace would be a chaotic endeavor. Yet they managed, often with surprising efficiency, through a blend of social pressure, spiritual belief, and yes, some truly peculiar punishments. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some regions, legal proceedings might involve diviners consulting with ancestral spirits, or even animal totems to discern truth or guilt. It wasn't always about presenting evidence in the way we understand it. Sometimes it was about interpreting signs, omens, or the pronouncements of someone believed to be a conduit to the spiritual realm. Imagine going to court, and the judge consults a chicken entrail. Okay, maybe not quite that dramatic, but you get the idea. It adds a whole new layer to judicial review, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether these spiritual interventions were primarily a means of social control, a genuine belief in divine justice, or a clever way to avoid intractable disputes. Perhaps it was all three blended together, like a perfectly brewed herbal tea. This blending of the sacred and the secular in legal matters is a recurring theme you'll notice as we continue our journey. It means that justice wasn't just about righting a wrong. It was about realigning the individual with the cosmic order, ensuring the community remained in good standing with the ancestors and the spirits of the land. It made transgressions not just legal infringements, but spiritual disturbances. As you settle deeper into the narrative, you begin to grasp the fundamental underpinnings of West African legal thought. Forget the concept of codified laws carved in stone tablets or written on scrolls. Here, the legal framework was intrinsically linked to communal well-being and the delicate balance of social harmony. Every individual was seen not as an isolated entity, but as a vital thread in the elaborate tapestry of the community. A crime, therefore, wasn't just an offense against one person. It was an offense against the entire collective, a tear in that communal fabric. This meant that the primary goal of justice wasn't always punitive in the sense of eye for an eye retribution, but rather restorative. The aim was to mend the tear, to re-establish equilibrium, and to reintegrate the transgressor, if possible, back into the social fold. It's like when you snag your favorite blanket. You don't just throw it away, do you? You try to reweave the thread. You see, without vast centralized bureaucracies or standing armies to enforce edicts, the strength of the law lay in its acceptance by the people and the pervasive influence of social pressure. Imagine living in a village where everyone knows everyone, and your reputation is your most valuable currency. The fear of ostracism or the loss of respect from your peers could be a far more potent deterrent than any physical punishment. This is a mainstream historical fact. Social cohesion was paramount in these societies, and legal systems were meticulously designed to preserve it. Disputes were often handled through elaborate mediation processes, often involving elders, griots, storytellers, and oral historians, or respected family heads, all working to find a mutually agreeable solution that prevented further discord. It was about dialogue, not just decree. For a quirky tidbit, consider the role of proverbs and riddles in legal education and dispute resolution. Instead of poring over dense legal texts, young people would learn principles of justice through engaging stories and pithy sayings passed down orally. A single hand cannot tie a bundle might teach about cooperation, while the fly that has no one to advise it follows the corpse into the grave could warn against stubbornness and isolation. Imagine a modern court where the judge delivers their verdict through a series of cryptic yet profound riddles. The evidence suggests the goat that chews the cud will eventually find grass. Now what does that tell you, eh? It certainly adds a certain poetic flair to the proceedings, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether these oral traditions were merely mnemonic devices for legal principles, or if they represented a more profound holistic approach to instilling ethical behavior and conflict resolution from childhood. Perhaps it was both a clever blend of education and moral guidance. The very concept of ownership, for instance, often differed from European notions. Land in many areas was seen as communal property, held in trust by the community for the benefit of all, rather than owned individually in perpetuity. This meant that disputes over resources often revolved around usufruct rights, the right to use and benefit from something, rather than absolute possession. You might have the right to farm a plot of land, but you couldn't necessarily sell it outright without community consent. This deep connection to shared resources further solidified the communal aspect of their legal systems. Everything circled back to the group. So as you picture yourself walking through those ancient West African villages, remember that their laws were not just rules to be followed, but a living, breathing part of their culture, constantly reinforced by storytelling, social interaction, and the ever-present understanding that individual actions had ripples that affected the entire pond. It was a system built on relationships, reciprocity, and a profound respect for the delicate balance of life within the community. The weight of communal expectation often served as the most powerful enforcer of the law. Now, as we ease further into this peculiar legal landscape, you're about to encounter a concept that might send a shiver down your modern spine: the trial by ordeal. This wasn't some quick legal maneuver. It was a deeply ingrained, often terrifying method of discerning truth and guilt when conventional evidence was lacking or disputed. Imagine yourself accused of a serious crime, theft perhaps, or even something as grave as sorcery, and your fate hinges not on witness testimony or forensic evidence, but on your ability to withstand a physically perilous test. It's the ultimate prove your innocence or suffer the consequences scenario, far removed from our current understanding of innocent until proven guilty. The genesis of trial by ordeal in West Africa, a mainstream historical fact, is rooted in the belief that the divine or ancestral spirits would intervene to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. It wasn't arbitrary cruelty, at least not in their view. It was seen as a direct appeal to a higher power, a cosmic lie detector test administered with very real stakes. People genuinely believed that an innocent person under the watchful eye of the spirits would be supernaturally shielded from harm, while the guilty would inevitably succumb to the ordeal's dangers. It was a spiritual gamble, a divine lottery, where the losers paid the ultimate price. You can almost feel the collective tension in the village as someone prepares to face such a trial, the air thick with anticipation and dread. For a quirky tidbit, some communities believed that merely suggesting an ordeal to a guilty person would cause them to confess on the spot, terrified of the divine retribution that awaited. It was like a psychological pre-ordeal, a reputation-shaking dare. All right, brave one, are you prepared to walk through the fire? And if the accused suddenly started sweating profusely and stuttering well, that was pretty much confession enough. Imagine that being admissible in court today. Your Honor, the defendant seemed unduly perturbed when I mentioned the hot iron. Historians still argue whether these ordeals were primarily designed to elicit confessions through fear, to provide a definitive resolution in intractable disputes, or genuinely believed to be a conduit for divine judgment. Perhaps it was a cunning blend of psychological manipulation and deep spiritual conviction, ensuring that justice or at least a resolution was always served. You see, these societies operated without formal police investigators or complex detective work. When a crime occurred, especially one with no clear perpetrator, or when two parties presented conflicting accounts, the community needed a decisive way to move forward. The trial by ordeal provided that resolution, often with a stark finality. It bypassed lengthy deliberations and the fallibility of human witnesses, instead placing the burden of proof literally on the accused's physical and spiritual fortitude. The community would gather often at a designated sacred spot to witness the spectacle. It was a communal event, reinforcing the shared belief system and the consequences of violating it. Whether it involved ingesting a substance exposure to heat or facing a natural danger, each ordeal was steeped in ritual and overseen by traditional religious leaders or elders, ensuring its perceived legitimacy. The process itself was as much a performance as a judgment, designed to impress upon everyone present the power of the communal law and the ever-present influence of the spiritual world. It was a very effective way to keep people in line, knowing that hiding guilt might not be as easy as avoiding human eyes. Now that you've grasped the intimidating concept of trial by ordeal, let's zoom in on one of its most fascinating and genuinely terrifying manifestations: the poison ordeal. Imagine the village elders gathered not around a well-worn book of laws, but around a small ornate calabash, or perhaps a rough wooden bowl containing a concoction that could either exonerate you or deliver a swift, agonizing end. This wasn't some weak herbal tea. We're talking about potent, naturally occurring toxins derived from specific plants. The most infamous among these was the sasswood from the Erythrophlium suaveolens tree, or in other regions the calabar bean Physostigma venenosum. The procedure was chillingly simple in its premise. You, the accused, would be required to ingest a dose of this prepared poison. A mainstream historical fact is that the belief underpinning this was that if you were innocent, the benevolent spirits or deities would either protect you from the poison's effects, or you would simply vomit it up, thus purging the lie and proving your purity. If, however, you were guilty, the poison would take hold, leading to severe illness, or more often death. It was a macabre test of divine favor, a chemical key to unlocking the truth, or so they believed. The stakes, as you can well imagine, were absolutely astronomical. Forget pleading the fifth. Here you were pleading for your life. For a quirky tidbit, the preparation and administration of these poisons were often highly ritualized, performed by a designated poison ordeal specialist, or diviner who held immense power within the community. These individuals were believed to possess not only the knowledge of the plants, but also the spiritual acumen to interpret the ordeal's outcome. They might adjust the dosage based on factors like the accused's perceived spiritual strength or the perceived gravity of the crime. Imagine a chemist who is also a high priest, and your life depends on their recipe. Historians still argue whether these specialists had a genuine understanding of toxicology, or if their varying dosages and preparation methods sometimes allowed for manipulation of the outcome. It's a fascinating thought where some innocent verdicts due to a weakened brew or truly divine intervention. You can almost feel the tension in the air as the accused stood before the community. The silence punctuated only by the rustle of leaves or the distant cries of birds. Every eye would be fixed on them, watching for the slightest tremor, the first sign of distress. If you managed to regurgitate the poison, perhaps after a lengthy period of discomfort, a collective sigh of relief, or perhaps a gasp of awe would sweep through the crowd. You would be cleansed, vindicated, and often welcomed back into the community with heightened respect. Your survival was seen as undeniable proof of your innocence and the direct favor of the spirits. Conversely, if the poison took its fatal hold, it wasn't just a physical death. It was often seen as a spiritual condemnation, reinforcing the community's belief in the ordeal's infallible nature. Your demise wasn't merely a consequence of the poison. It was divine judgment made manifest. This dual nature of the poison ordeal, as both a physical test and a spiritual pronouncement, made it an incredibly potent tool for maintaining social order and resolving disputes in societies without formal legal mechanisms as we understand them today. It was a form of justice that was both terrifyingly direct and deeply intertwined with their worldview. Having explored the chilling mechanics of the poison ordeal, let's now plunge into another equally daunting, yet perhaps less immediately fatal form of judicial test, the water ordeal. This wasn't about a relaxing dip in a spring. It was a deeply symbolic and often physically grueling test designed to reveal truth through submersion temperature, or even the unpredictable flow of a river. You might find yourself standing at the edge of a murky pool or a swift-flowing stream, your destiny hanging on your ability to either sink or float, to endure the scalding or the chilling. One common manifestation, a mainstream historical fact, involved submersion. The accused would be bound sometimes with weights and thrown into a body of water. The belief here was counterintuitive to modern thought. If you floated, you were considered guilty as the pure water supposedly rejected you. If you sank, you were deemed innocent as the water embraced your purity. Of course, the practical reality of sinking often meant drowning, which, while proving innocence, wasn't exactly a cheerful outcome. Imagine the collective gasp of the crowd as you're plunged beneath the surface, everyone holding their breath, waiting for the verdict of the water. It was a baptism of truth with life or death as the consequence. For a quirky tidbit, some water ordeals involved boiling water. You, the accused, might be required to retrieve an object, perhaps a sacred stone, or a marked piece of metal from a pot of vigorously boiling water. The severity of your burns, or the lack thereof, would then determine your guilt or innocence. An innocent person was believed to be protected from the scalding heat, while the guilty would suffer severe blisters and burns, clear marks of their transgression. It's a bit like a medieval version of hot potato, except the potato wants to convict you. Historians still argue whether the temperature of the water was always truly boiling, or if variations allowed for manipulation by the orchestrators, giving them a subtle means to influence outcomes based on their pre-existing biases or knowledge of the case. The human element, even in divine tests, always seems to find a way in, doesn't it? Another form of water ordeal involved crossing dangerous rivers, sometimes infested with crocodiles, or navigating treacherous rapids. Your survival against seemingly insurmountable odds would be interpreted as divine proof of your innocence. If the river claimed you, then your guilt was confirmed. This particular ordeal connected directly to the natural environment, treating the elements themselves as agents of divine judgment. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we vaguely referenced? In some areas, facing these formidable creatures was literally part of the judicial process. These water-based trials, much like the poison ordeals, were not merely physical tests. They were deeply spiritual ceremonies, often accompanied by invocations, prayers, and rituals performed by religious leaders. The community would gather as spectators, their collective belief reinforcing the legitimacy and finality of the water's judgment. It created a powerful deterrent for would-be wrongdoers, knowing that their perceived innocence might literally hinge on their ability to defy the laws of nature, or at least the laws of gravity and thermodynamics. It really makes a cold shower seem like a walk in the park. Having braved the murky depths of the water ordeal, let's now turn our attention to the intense heat of the fiery trials of faith. These were tests that, much like their watery counterparts, relied on the belief that divine intervention would shield the innocent from physical harm, while the guilty would bear undeniable marks of their transgression. Imagine the crackle of a bonfire, the hiss of a glowing iron, and the pervasive scent of wood smoke mingling with the scent of fear. Your fate once again would be placed in the hands of elements with a very direct and painful outcome. A mainstream historical fact is that one common fiery ordeal involved the hot iron. An accused individual would be required to grasp a piece of heated metal, often a knife blade, a hoe, or a specially prepared rod, for a prescribed period. After releasing the iron, the hand would be immediately wrapped and sealed. After a set number of days, the bandage would be removed. If the hand showed no burns, or only very slight marks, innocence was declared. However, if severe blisters, charring, or infection were present, guilt was confirmed. It was a brutal form of divine branding, a visible mark of truth or deception. You can almost feel the nervous energy of the onlookers, their eyes fixed on the accused's hand, waiting for the reveal. For a quirky tidbit, some fiery ordeals involved walking over hot coals or embers. The belief was that an innocent person's feet would emerge unscathed, while the guilty would suffer agonizing burns. Imagine trying to keep your poker face as you step onto glowing embers, hoping for a miraculous intervention. This particular method often relied on the coolness of the fire itself, being a sign rather than intense heat. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of injury in some cases was due to specific techniques known only to the practitioners, like walking very quickly, or only touching cooler areas, or if it genuinely reflected a strong psychological component where belief could to some extent influence physical reaction. It's certainly a more intense version of walking on Lego bricks, isn't it? These trials, much like the other ordeals, were not simple acts of violence. They were deeply ritualized ceremonies, often overseen by spiritual leaders, who would invoke ancestral spirits or deities. Prayers and incantations would accompany the heating of the iron or the tending of the coals, imbuing the process with a sacred weight. The entire community would gather to witness, reinforcing the communal acceptance of the ordeal's legitimacy. It created a powerful collective psychological impact, solidifying the idea that no wrongdoing could truly be hidden from the eyes of the divine. The physical pain and potential disfigurement associated with these fiery trials served as an incredibly strong deterrent. The idea that your own body would betray your guilt, displaying irrefutable evidence for all to see, was a potent motivator for honesty and adherence to communal norms. So as you continue to imagine yourself in this ancient world, remember that justice was often raw, visceral, and directly tied to the fundamental elements of nature. Fire, water, and earth, all believed to be conduits for a higher infallible truth. From the scorching flames we now descend into the murky primeval waters, where one of the most uniquely terrifying judicial arbiters resided, the crocodile. Yes, you heard that right. In some regions of medieval West Africa, particularly areas blessed or cursed depending on your perspective, with abundant rivers and their toothy inhabitants, the crocodile was occasionally conscripted into the service of justice. Imagine the scene, not a courtroom with stern-faced judges, but a riverbank filled with hushed anticipation as a suspected wrongdoer faces a creature of pure ancient instinct. A mainstream historical fact is that in societies like some among the Mossi people in present-day Burkina Faso, or certain groups along the Niger River, sacred crocodiles were sometimes kept in designated ponds or sections of rivers. These animals were revered, often seen as embodying ancestral spirits or having a direct connection to the divine. When human evidence failed or disputes became intractable, an accused individual might be brought to the crocodile's domain. The method varied. Sometimes the accused would be forced to wade into the water, or perhaps to retrieve an object from the water's edge. If the crocodile ignored them, or even better swam away, innocence was declared. If, however, the crocodile attacked or even merely approached aggressively, it was interpreted as a divine verdict of guilt. It was less about legal precedent and more about natural selection with a spiritual twist. For a quirky tidbit, in some accounts, individuals suspected of wrongdoing were not necessarily thrown to the crocodiles, but rather were forced to wash their hands in the same water as the sacred crocodiles. If their hands were bitten, guilt was confirmed. If they remained unscathed, they were innocent. It puts a whole new spin on hand-washing before dinner, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether the crocodiles were deliberately starved or provoked before these trials, or if the sheer unpredictability of wild animals truly made it a matter of pure chance and divine will. Was it manipulation, or simply faith in the raw power of nature? You can almost feel the primordial fear that would grip an accused person standing at the edge of that water, knowing that their fate lay in the jaws of a creature that cared nothing for human laws or pleas. The slow, silent approach of a reptilian eye just above the water's surface. The barely perceptible ripple would be enough to send shivers down even the most stoic spine. This wasn't just physical danger. It was spiritual terror. The very elements of nature seemingly turning against you in judgment. The communal aspect of these crocodile ordeals was also paramount. The entire village would gather, witnessing the raw drama unfold. The outcome, whatever it was, would be accepted as the definitive truth, a verdict rendered by the forces of the natural world, guided by the unseen hand of the spirits. It served as an incredibly powerful deterrent, instilling a deep respect or perhaps simply fear for the natural world and the laws of the community that mirrored its unforgiving nature. So when you think of justice, remember that in some corners of medieval West Africa, it literally had teeth. As you navigate the treacherous waters and fiery landscapes of West African justice, it becomes increasingly clear that the physical ordeals were often merely one component of a much larger, intricate web of spiritual intervention. The success or failure of these trials wasn't just about a plant's toxicity or a metal's heat. It was profoundly tied to the belief that deities, ancestral spirits, and various supernatural forces were active participants in discerning truth and administering judgment. Imagine living in a world where the very air around you hums with spiritual energy, and every significant event, especially one concerning justice, is viewed through a sacred lens. A mainstream historical fact is that traditional religious leaders, such as diviners, priests, or shamans, held immense power and influence within these legal systems. They weren't just mediators. They were seen as conduits to the spiritual realm, capable of interpreting omens, communicating with ancestors, and invoking divine will. Their pronouncements, often delivered after elaborate rituals, trances, or the interpretation of natural signs, carried significant weight. It was their spiritual authority that legitimized the ordeals, turning a dangerous physical test into a sacred process of truth-finding. Without their spiritual imprimatur, the whole system might have crumbled. For a quirky tidbit, some communities believed that an accused person's guilt could be revealed not through direct ordeal, but through the behavior of certain animals or even natural phenomena. A sudden inexplicable drought after a crime or unusual animal migrations might be interpreted by a diviner as a sign of divine displeasure, with the community directly linked to an unpunished transgression. Imagine the pressure on everyone to confess if the chickens suddenly stop laying eggs. Historians still argue whether these spiritual interpretations were genuinely believed by everyone, or if they sometimes served as a convenient way for powerful religious figures to exert control and influence over community affairs, steering outcomes without direct physical intervention. Perhaps it was a mixture of both sincere faith intertwined with subtle social manipulation. You see, in a society without modern scientific understanding of cause and effect, the spiritual realm provided answers to the inexplicable. If a person died mysteriously, or crops failed without obvious reason, the immediate assumption wasn't always a natural cause. It could be attributed to witchcraft, a curse, or the anger of neglected ancestors. In such cases, legal proceedings would often begin with a consultation with a spiritual specialist to identify the spiritual root of the problem, and by extension, the human perpetrator. It was a holistic approach to justice where the physical and metaphysical were inextricably linked. This pervasive belief in spiritual intervention meant that even after an ordeal, communal rituals might be performed to cleanse the community, appease offended spirits, and restore cosmic balance. Justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about ensuring the well-being of the entire collective spiritually and physically. The weight of ancestral expectations and divine watchful eyes served as a constant unseen jury, making it very difficult to escape accountability in the minds of the people. It truly put a new spin on feeling watched. As you continue your journey through the legal landscape of medieval West Africa, you'll find that once a verdict, often delivered through an ordeal or spiritual pronouncement, had been reached, the next crucial step involved communal sentencing practices. This wasn't about a single judge handing down a sentence from on high. Instead, the entire community, or at least its most respected members, played a vital role in determining and enforcing the appropriate consequence. Imagine a town meeting where everyone has a say in what happens next, driven by a shared understanding of what it takes to mend societal ruptures. A mainstream historical fact is that punishments were rarely, if ever, arbitrary. They were carefully considered and often aimed at restoration and reconciliation, rather than purely punitive retribution. The goal was to re-establish the social balance that the crime had disrupted. For instance, if someone committed theft, the primary focus wasn't just on locking them away, a concept that barely existed in these societies, but on ensuring the stolen goods were returned, and perhaps that the thief performed labor or offered compensation to the victim and their family. It was about healing the wound, not just punishing the hand that wielded the knife. This made the community itself the ultimate enforcer, as social pressure and collective agreement carried immense weight. For a quirky tidbit, public shaming often played a significant role in sentencing, sometimes even more potent than physical punishment. A transgressor might be forced to wear a specific embarrassing item of clothing, or carry a symbolic burden through the village for a set period. Imagine being made to wear a hat shaped like a chicken for a week because you stole one. The sheer mortification could be a far greater deterrent than any prison cell. Historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these shame-based punishments relied more on the innate human aversion to public disgrace, or on the tightly knit communal structures where reputation was everything. It's safe to say, in a world without anonymity, your social standing was your very oxygen. You see, because these societies often lacked centralized carceral systems, the community itself became the prison. Every gaze, every whispered conversation, every cold shoulder served as a constant reminder of the transgression. Ostracism, even temporary, could be a devastating punishment, cutting an individual off from the very source of their identity and survival. The fear of losing face, of being seen as an outcast, was a powerful force for conformity. Furthermore, many punishments involved some form of restitution or communal service. A person who damaged property might be required to rebuild it. Someone who caused harm might be made to work for the injured party or their family. This practical approach ensured that justice served a tangible purpose, actively repairing the harm caused and reintegrating the individual through their contributions. It was about finding a path back to productivity and acceptance within the collective, not just banishing them to a dark hole. So, as you picture the aftermath of a legal proceeding, imagine the careful deliberation of elders, the murmur of the crowd, and the collective decision to reweave the fabric of community, one stitch at a time. From the nuanced communal sentencing, we now delve into one of the most severe and socially devastating punishments in medieval West Africa: exile, or, as it was often profoundly understood, a form of social death. Imagine being stripped, not just of your freedom, but of your identity, your family, your very right to exist within the known world. This wasn't merely being sent to a different village. It was a severance of all ties, a forced removal from the collective tapestry, leaving you utterly alone. A mainstream historical fact is that in societies built on strong kinship ties and communal interdependence, banishment was often considered a harsher fate than even physical harm, as survival outside the protective embrace of the group was incredibly difficult, if not impossible. An individual cast out was denied access to communal land-water protection and the vital network of support that defined existence. You were quite literally no one and nowhere. The fear of exile was a potent deterrent, forcing individuals to adhere strictly to social norms lest they face the ultimate loneliness. For a quirky tidbit, in some instances, exile wasn't just physical removal. It involved elaborate rituals to symbolically kill the individual from the community's memory. Their name might be forbidden, their possessions distributed, and their very existence erased from communal narratives. Imagine being alive but officially forgotten, as if you never were. Historians still argue whether such symbolic social death rituals were more about protecting the community from the contamination of the transgressor, or if they were designed to amplify the psychological torment of the exiled individual, hoping to prevent their return or serve as a warning to others. It certainly put a new spin on being cancelled, didn't it? You see, for most people in medieval West Africa, their identity was inextricably linked to their family, their clan, and their village. To be removed from this framework was to lose your sense of self, your past, and your future. There were no social safety nets for the exiled, no bustling cities where one could simply disappear into the crowd. Every stranger was a potential threat, every resource a challenge to acquire alone. The wild, the unknown became your only companion, and it was a harsh master. The decision to impose exile was usually reserved for the most grievous offenses. Repeated violations of taboos, severe and unrepented witchcraft, or actions that gravely threatened the very fabric of the community. It was a last resort, a desperate measure to preserve the integrity of the collective when an individual was deemed irrevocably beyond reintegration. The process would often be public, serving as a stark reminder to all present of the absolute boundaries of communal tolerance. So as you contemplate this ultimate punishment, reflect on the profound psychological impact of losing everything that makes you you. Forced to wander outside the protective circle of belonging, a ghost in a living world. Stepping away from the stark despair of exile, let's pivot to a more nuanced aspect of West African justice, the prevailing emphasis on restitution over retribution. While modern legal systems often prioritize punishment, fines, imprisonment, or even capital punishment, medieval West African societies frequently aimed to repair the damage caused by a transgression and restore balance to the community. Imagine a system where, after a wrong, the primary question isn't, how severely should we punish, but, how can we make things right again? A mainstream historical fact is that in many West African legal frameworks, a significant portion of judicial proceedings focused on requiring the wrongdoer to compensate the victim or their family. This could involve financial payments, labor goods, or even ritual apologies. For instance, if livestock were stolen, the thief might not only have to return the animals, but also offer additional animals as compensation for the distress and economic loss caused. It was about tangible repair, about ensuring that the injured party was made whole, or as close to whole as possible. This approach often fostered reconciliation, as the resolution directly addressed the harm. For a quirky tidbit, in some instances, a form of symbolic restitution might be enacted particularly for offenses that caused spiritual rather than just material harm. This could involve communal ceremonies or offerings to appease angered spirits, with the transgressor playing a central role in the ritual. Imagine having to publicly apologize to a tree because you cut it down without permission, or making an offering to the river spirits because you polluted their waters. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on restitution was primarily pragmatic, reflecting the communal need for stability and economic recovery after a crime, or if it sprang from a deeper philosophical understanding of interconnectedness, where harm to one was harm to all, and thus healing had to be communal. It's certainly a more active form of apology than a simple, "I'm sorry," isn't it? You see, in communities where resources were often shared and interdependent, and where everyone played a role in the collective survival, disruptions caused by crime were felt by all. A theft didn't just hurt the owner of the stolen goods. It undermined trust within the community and potentially strained relationships between families or clans. Therefore, the goal of justice was to rebuild that trust and mend those strained relationships. This meant that the process often involved extensive mediation and negotiation, with elders or other respected figures acting as facilitators. This focus on restitution also often meant that the accused, even after confessing or being found guilty, wasn't simply cast aside. Instead, they were given a pathway back to being a productive member of society by actively participating in the process of repair. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about ensuring that the community could continue to function harmoniously. So as you reflect on this principle, consider how different our world might be if restorative justice were always the primary goal, rather than a secondary consideration. It really highlights a different kind of wisdom, doesn't it? Having explored the restorative heart of West African justice, we now turn to a darker, more complex consequence that could sometimes arise from severe transgressions: enslavement. While the concept of slavery might immediately conjure images of transatlantic chattel slavery, it's crucial to understand that forms of servitude existed within West African societies long before European contact, often as a result of debt warfare, or indeed certain legal ramifications. Imagine a system where your freedom wasn't an inherent right, but a privilege that could be forfeited due to your actions. A mainstream historical fact is that in many West African kingdoms and communities, a person could become enslaved as a direct consequence of committing a serious crime, particularly one that involved significant financial debt or a grave offense against another family or clan. This form of judicial slavery was often a means of providing restitution to the wronged party. If an offender could not pay a required fine or provide adequate compensation, they might be compelled to work for the victim's family for a set period, or even for life, to offset the damage. This was less about inherent racial inferiority, a concept largely absent in pre-colonial West African slavery, and more about a severe form of legal recompense. For a quirky tidbit, in some instances, an entire family might bear collective responsibility for a crime, and if the main perpetrator couldn't fulfill the terms of their restitution, A family member, particularly a younger one, might be offered into temporary servitude to settle the debt. It was a stark reminder of the deep interconnectedness of kinship groups and the collective responsibility everyone felt. Imagine being collateral for your cousin's misdeeds. Historians still argue whether this form of judicial enslavement was primarily a pragmatic economic solution for resolving disputes and compensating victims, or if it also served as a powerful social control mechanism, instilling a profound fear of incurring debt or committing serious crimes that could ripple through an entire lineage. Perhaps it was a chilling blend of both, ensuring accountability at the deepest communal level. You see, in a world without formalized credit systems or extensive prisons, enslavement offered a practical, albeit harsh, solution for ensuring justice was served and victims were compensated. It also provided a labor force for larger agricultural projects or household needs. However, it's important to differentiate this from the chattel slavery that emerged with the transatlantic trade. Slaves within West African societies often had rights, could marry, own property, and sometimes even gain their freedom or have their children inherit free status. Their status was often more akin to an indentured servant or a person in a state of perpetual debt than the dehumanized property of later eras. Nevertheless, for the individual, the loss of freedom was profound. To go from being a respected member of a lineage to someone whose labor and life were controlled by another was a dramatic fall from grace. It served as a powerful reminder that while communal justice often sought reconciliation, it also held the capacity for severe and life-altering consequences for those who profoundly disrupted the societal fabric. So as you drift further into this history, remember that the threads of justice, freedom, and servitude were often intricately and tragically intertwined. Having explored the nuanced and often tragic path to enslavement, let's now turn our attention to one of the most physically grim, albeit rarer, forms of punishment: mutilation. While not as widespread as restitution or banishment, and certainly not the preferred method of justice, the deliberate infliction of physical injury served as a stark and irreversible consequence for certain egregious offenses in parts of medieval West Africa. Imagine a world where your very body could bear the permanent mark of your transgression, a public and painful reminder for both you and the community. A mainstream historical fact is that mutilation, when it occurred, was often reserved for crimes considered profoundly disruptive to social order, such as repeated theft, perjury, or specific acts of sacrilege. The form of mutilation often correlated symbolically with the crime. For instance, a habitual thief might lose a hand, while someone who committed grave perjury might have their tongue or part of it removed. The aim was not just to punish, but also to incapacitate for future wrongdoing and to create a highly visible permanent deterrent. It was a tangible, living warning to others. For a quirky tidbit, in some extremely rare and localized cases, certain communities might brand a transgressor with a specific mark or symbol on their skin, not necessarily as a punishment in itself, but to identify them as a proven wrongdoer. This acted as a permanent social label affecting their standing and interactions for life. Imagine a medieval version of a scarlet letter permanently etched onto your skin. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of mutilation was pure retribution, a means of preventing repeat offenses, or a powerful symbolic act to ritually cleanse the community of the transgression. Perhaps it was all three, a grim reflection of a society grappling with profound challenges to its order. You see, in societies without formal prisons to hold offenders long term, and where banishment might not always be feasible or desirable, physical mutilation offered a swift and decisive form of justice. It meant the offender remained within the community, albeit in a diminished state, serving as a constant object lesson. The psychological impact on the individual would have been immense, a daily reminder of their crime and a constant marker of their diminished status. For the community, it was a visceral demonstration of the severity of their laws and the irreversible consequences of breaking them. While certainly shocking to our modern sensibilities, it's important to understand this practice within its historical context. These were societies striving to maintain order and cohesion with limited resources and different philosophical underpinnings of justice. The severity of the punishment was often a reflection of the perceived threat the crime posed to the very survival and harmony of the collective. So as you contemplate the lasting physical and psychological scars of mutilation, remember the world that shaped these grim decisions, a world far removed from our own concepts of rehabilitation and reintegration. From the chilling permanence of mutilation, let's transition to a punishment that, while often non-physical, could inflict a profound and lasting sting: public humiliation. In the tightly knit communities of medieval West Africa, where reputation was currency and social standing, paramount the deliberate exposure of a wrongdoer's misdeeds to the scorn and judgment of their peers could be a far more potent deterrent than any dungeon. Imagine being paraded through the village, every eye upon you, every whisper, a condemnation your dignity stripped away for all to see. A mainstream historical fact is that public shaming was a widespread and highly effective form of social control in many traditional West African societies. It served multiple purposes: to condemn the individual's actions, to reinforce community norms, and to provide a cathartic release for the collective outrage caused by the transgression. This could involve public confessions, forced apologies, or symbolic acts of degradation. The sheer exposure of one's misdeeds to the collective gaze, especially in societies where anonymity was virtually impossible, meant that the shame could linger for years, impacting one's marriage prospects, trade opportunities, and overall social acceptance. For a quirky tidbit, certain communities might employ shame songs or satirical performances designed to ridicule a transgressor and publicly broadcast their misdeeds. Imagine a catchy tune about how you tried to sneak an extra yam from the communal harvest, sung by the local griot, with a mischievous twinkle in their eye. Historians still argue whether these forms of public humiliation were primarily about reforming the individual through societal pressure, or if they served more as a ritualistic reassertion of communal values and a warning to potential future transgressors. It's a fascinating thought. Could a catchy song about your screw-up be more effective than a jail cell? Quite possibly, especially if it followed you around for years. You see, in a world where personal identity was inextricably linked to one's social role and the respect accorded by others, the deliberate destruction of one's public image was a devastating blow. There was no escaping the collective memory of the community. Every interaction would be filtered through the lens of your past transgression, every handshake a subtle reminder of your shame. This constant social pressure often led to genuine remorse and a strong desire to reintegrate and redeem oneself, proving the effectiveness of social stigma as a tool for behavioral correction. These public displays of shame also reinforce the power of the community itself as the ultimate arbiter of morality. They served as communal lessons, vividly illustrating the consequences of deviating from accepted behavior. So as you picture the hushed yet intensely watchful faces of the villagers, remember that sometimes the sharpest punishments were not those that drew blood, but those that cut deepest into the fabric of one's reputation and standing within the tight-knit world of communal life. It truly makes you think about the power of reputation, doesn't it? From the biting sting of public shame, let's now consider a concept that in medieval West Africa was far less common than you might expect, based on modern societies: the idea of jail and confinement. Forget the hulking stone fortresses or crowded cell blocks we associate with prisons today. In these vibrant open communities, long-term incarceration as a primary form of punishment was largely absent, or at best existed in highly localized and temporary forms. Imagine a world where locking someone up simply wasn't the go-to solution for wrongdoing. A mainstream historical fact is that permanent dedicated penal institutions in the European sense were not a widespread feature of pre-colonial West African justice systems. This was largely due to logistical, economic, and philosophical reasons. Communities were often self-sufficient, and maintaining a non-working population in confinement was an economic burden. Furthermore, the emphasis was often on restitution, social reintegration, or severe definitive consequences like exile or even judicial slavery, rather than prolonged deprivation of liberty. Why feed and guard someone when they could be made to compensate their victim, or simply removed from the community entirely? For a quirky tidbit, temporary forms of confinement did exist often as a precursor to an ordeal, a period of deliberation before sentencing, or as a means to hold an accused individual deemed dangerous before a communal judgment could be rendered. These holding cells might be a secluded hut, a guarded compound, or even a tree with limited escape routes, more akin to house arrest than a modern prison. Imagine being jailed in a comfortable, albeit monitored straw hut for a few days while the elders decided your fate. Historians still argue whether the absence of widespread prisons reflects a more humane approach to justice, a practical adaptation to communal living, or simply a different understanding of how to manage offenders when resources for long-term detention were scarce. Perhaps it was a clever blend of practicality and inherent social structure. You see, the very fabric of these societies made extensive imprisonment unnecessary. Social pressure, the pervasive watchful eyes of the community, and the fear of ostracism or exile served as powerful and constant forms of social confinement. Every member of the community was in a sense a jailer, ensuring adherence to norms through collective expectation. If you remembered that discussion about your reputation being your currency, this becomes clearer. The prison was often the very community itself, and the bars were the disapproving glances and the silent judgments of your peers. When an offense did occur, the focus was typically on swift resolution and re-establishment of harmony. Lengthy periods of incarceration would interrupt a person's productive role in the community and often contradict the goal of making amends. Therefore, punishments tended to be either immediate, like an ordeal, restorative like restitution, or definitive like exile or judicial enslavement. So as you reflect on the absence of widespread dungeons and cells, consider how different this approach was to justice, prioritizing social cohesion and tangible resolution over the abstract idea of doing time. Having explored the curious absence of widespread prisons, let's now turn our attention to the figures who largely filled the roles of judge, jury, and sometimes even executioner in medieval West African societies, the elders and chiefs. These weren't elected officials in the modern sense. Their authority stemmed from a blend of age, wisdom, lineage, and often spiritual connection. Imagine a group of respected gray-haired individuals whose pronouncements carried the weight of generations of accumulated knowledge and the implicit backing of the entire community. A mainstream historical fact is that in most traditional West African communities, local governance and judicial functions were primarily vested in councils of elders or the village chief or oba emir, etc., depending on the specific kingdom or ethnic group. These individuals were responsible for mediating disputes, interpreting customary law, presiding over trials by ordeal, and ultimately sanctioning punishments. Their authority was rarely absolute in a tyrannical sense. Rather, it was based on consensus consultation with various family heads and adherence to established traditions. They were the living repositories of the community's legal and ethical code. For a quirky tidbit, the process of becoming an elder or chief was often less about formal qualifications and more about demonstrated character wisdom and the ability to maintain social harmony. Sometimes a chief might even be chosen through a divinatory process reflecting the belief that leaders were divinely appointed or guided by ancestral spirits. Imagine a job interview where your past good deeds and the favor of unseen spirits are your primary qualifications. Historians still argue whether the power of these leaders was genuinely democratic, reflecting the will of the community, or if it sometimes allowed for the entrenchment of specific family or lineage power, subtly influencing judicial outcomes. Perhaps it was a dynamic balance always shifting with the needs and personalities involved. You see, these elders and chiefs were not detached legal professionals. They were integral members of the community, intimately familiar with the individuals involved in disputes, their family histories, and the nuances of local custom. This intimate knowledge often allowed for more personalized and context-sensitive justice, focusing on repairing relationships and maintaining peace rather than adhering to rigid, impersonal legal codes. They understood the ripple effects of every decision on the delicate web of village life. Their role as mediators was often as crucial as their role as judges. They would tirelessly work to bring opposing parties to a resolution using their influence, wisdom, and knowledge of customary law to guide negotiations. Their authority wasn't imposed, but earned, constantly reinforced by their ability to resolve conflicts fairly and maintain the well-being of the collective. So as you picture the scene, envision not a cold courtroom, but a shaded gathering place where wise men and women heavy with the weight of communal responsibility thoughtfully weigh the scales of justice, ensuring the delicate balance of their world endures. From the wise deliberations of elders and chiefs, we now glide into one of the most enigmatic and feared categories of transgression in medieval West Africa: witchcraft accusations and trials. This wasn't just about perceived wrongdoing. It was about insidious, unseen malevolence, a spiritual crime that could bring sickness, death, or misfortune upon individuals and the entire community. Imagine a pervasive dread, a subtle paranoia that could suddenly flare into accusations, leading to terrifying and often brutal consequences. A mainstream historical fact is that the belief in witchcraft was deeply ingrained in many West African societies, serving as a powerful explanation for illness, unexplained deaths, crop failures, and other misfortunes that defied rational explanation. A witch was not merely a deviant. They were seen as someone possessing malevolent spiritual power, capable of causing harm through supernatural means. Accusations of witchcraft were extremely serious, carrying immense social stigma, and often leading to severe, even fatal punishments, as they were believed to threaten the very fabric of existence. For a quirky tidbit, certain communities employed witch doctors, or diviners, specifically trained to identify witches, often through elaborate rituals, trances, or the interpretation of strange occurrences. These specialists might use specific divination tools like kola nuts, cowrie shells, or even gazing into a bowl of water to uncover the unseen hand of witchcraft. Imagine having your guilt determined by the pattern of tossed shells. Historians still argue whether these accusations were primarily a means of social control, targeting marginalized individuals or those who defied norms, or if they represented a genuine fear of spiritual malevolence that dictated communal responses. Perhaps it was a complex interplay where real anxieties were channeled into existing social structures. You see, the fear of witchcraft was palpable because its effects were perceived as indiscriminate and devastating. Unlike a thief who could be identified and made to offer restitution, a witch operated in the shadows, their power unseen, their intentions malicious. This often led to a desperate need for identification and neutralization, sometimes resulting in trials by ordeal that were even more perilous than those for conventional crimes. The accused, already battling intense social suspicion, would often face the poison ordeal or other dangerous tests, with the community's collective fear amplifying the pressure. The outcome of a witchcraft trial was often definitive. If found guilty, the accused might face execution, banishment, or forced confession and ritual cleansing. The community sought not just to punish, but to utterly neutralize the perceived spiritual threat. The terror of witchcraft accusations meant that people were often hyper-aware of their behavior, lest they be seen as secretive, envious, or unusual qualities that could in a fearful moment be interpreted as signs of dark spiritual power. So as you drift into this unsettling aspect of justice, consider the profound impact of a belief system where unseen forces dictated so much of life and where suspicion could be a death sentence. Having explored the chilling shadow cast by witchcraft accusations, let's now consider how the burgeoning trans-Saharan trade began to subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, reshape the legal landscapes of medieval West Africa. Imagine vibrant caravan routes snaking across the vast desert, carrying not just gold, salt, and enslaved people, but also new ideas, new customs, and new challenges that inevitably put pressure on existing legal frameworks. This wasn't just an economic exchange. It was a cultural and legal crucible. A mainstream historical fact is that the trans-Saharan trade routes, which flourished from the 8th to the 16th centuries, connected the kingdoms and empires of West Africa with North Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. This brought immense wealth and prosperity to empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, but also introduced new populations, new types of goods, and crucially new forms of disputes that traditional localized legal systems weren't always equipped to handle. Suddenly, you weren't just dealing with a dispute between two villagers. You might have a dispute between a local merchant and a Berber trader from across the desert. For a quirky tidbit, the growth of trade sometimes led to the development of specific merchant laws, or customs often based on agreements between different trading groups which operated somewhat independently of the more traditional communal laws. These specialized legal understandings might dictate fair prices standards for goods or protocols, for resolving disputes between traders from different regions. Imagine a sort of early international trade court, but conducted under a desert tent. Historians still argue whether these trade-specific legal norms were a genuine evolution of indigenous legal thought, or if they were primarily influenced by external, particularly Islamic legal traditions brought by the traders themselves. It certainly blurred the lines between local custom and broader commercial necessities. You see, the increased flow of goods and people meant new types of crimes could emerge. Large-scale caravan raids, sophisticated counterfeiting, or complex contract disputes between parties who shared no common lineage or ancestral spirits presented challenges to systems primarily designed for internal communal harmony. The elders who traditionally knew everyone and their history now faced strangers with different customs and expectations. This pressure often led to a more formalized approach to justice, especially in the major trading cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne. Furthermore, the wealth generated by trade allowed for the development of larger, more centralized states, which in turn could afford to develop more complex administrative and legal structures. Instead of relying solely on communal consensus, some rulers began to establish specific courts or appoint designated judges to handle commercial disputes, often supplementing or even superseding traditional methods like ordeals for these particular types of cases. So as you drift into the economic currents of this era, remember that the clinking of gold and the rustle of trade goods were not just sounds of commerce, but also the subtle architects of legal change, slowly but surely transforming the very nature of justice in medieval West Africa. Building on the subtle shifts brought by the trans-Saharan trade, we now arrive at a truly transformative force in the legal landscape of medieval West Africa, the influence of Islamic law, or Sharia. As Muslim traders and scholars traversed the desert, they brought with them not just goods and knowledge, but an entirely new codified legal system that would gradually integrate with and sometimes supersede existing indigenous customs in many regions. Imagine the confluence of ancient oral traditions with a written legal framework derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, creating a fascinating hybrid of justice. A mainstream historical fact is that by the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in major urban centers and trading hubs like Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne, Islamic law became increasingly prominent. Rulers of empires like Mali and Songhai embraced Islam, and with it came the adoption of Sharia courts, qadis, Islamic judges, and a more formalized approach to judicial procedure. This meant a shift, at least in these urban areas, from trial by ordeal and spiritual pronouncements to a system based on evidence, witness testimony, and a written legal code. For commercial disputes, property rights, and specific criminal matters, Sharia offered a clear, universal framework that appealed to the increasingly cosmopolitan nature of these trading empires. For a quirky tidbit, the integration of Islamic law wasn't always a complete overhaul. Rather, it often resulted in a fascinating legal syncretism where elements of Sharia were blended with existing customary laws. For instance, while a qadi might preside over a case involving a commercial contract, the punishment for a local dispute might still involve traditional restitution or even a communal ordeal, especially in rural areas far from the urban centers. Imagine a legal system where sometimes you consult a written code and other times you're back to interpreting the behavior of a sacred crocodile. Historians still argue whether this blend was a strategic move by rulers to consolidate power and legitimize their rule through a universal religious framework, or if it was a genuine and organic adoption by a populace seeking a more robust and codified system of justice. Perhaps it was both a practical adaptation that also resonated spiritually. You see, Sharia provided a level of predictability and uniformity that customary law, with its regional variations and reliance on oral tradition, sometimes lacked. For merchants engaged in long-distance trade, a common legal framework across different regions was incredibly beneficial. It also offered a system for dealing with concepts like contracts, inheritance, and property in a more standardized way. The introduction of literacy, often tied to Islamic scholarship, further cemented the shift as legal judgments could be recorded and referenced. However, it's crucial to remember that this influence was not uniform. While coastal areas and major trading cities might have adopted Sharia more comprehensively, many inland and rural communities continued to operate largely under their traditional customary laws, often incorporating Islamic principles where they aligned with existing values. So as you drift into this period of legal transformation, consider the profound impact of a new faith, bringing with it a comprehensive legal philosophy, shaping the very definition of right and wrong, and laying the groundwork for a hybridized justice system that continues to echo in the region even today. Transitioning from the grand legal systems influenced by Islam, let's now consider a more intimate yet equally fundamental aspect of justice in medieval West Africa: the intersection of gender and justice. You might wonder how legal processes and punishments differed for men and women. And the answer, as is often the case with history, is complex, nuanced, and deeply tied to the social roles and expectations of the time. Imagine a world where your very sex could subtly or overtly shape your encounter with the law. A mainstream historical fact is that while women in many West African societies held significant social and economic power, participating in trade, agriculture, and even sometimes holding positions of leadership, their legal standing, and the types of offenses they might be accused of, or the punishments they faced, often differed from those of men. Crimes related to family honor, marriage, and fertility were often viewed with particular gravity when committed by women. For instance, adultery by a woman might be treated more severely than by a man, given its implications for lineage, purity, and inheritance. For a quirky tidbit, in some communities, disputes involving women might be handled not by the male elders, but by councils of older women, especially in matters pertaining to domestic issues, child-rearing, or certain forms of communal conflict. These women's courts operated under their own customary laws, often prioritizing reconciliation and the well-being of the family. Imagine a legal system where sometimes the court is just a circle of wise grandmothers settling matters with a knowing glance and an ancient proverb. Historians still argue whether these separate legal spheres for women provided them with greater agency and a degree of autonomy and justice, or if they simply reinforced existing gender roles by confining women's legal power to specific traditionally female domains. Perhaps it was a pragmatic adaptation that offered both limitations and opportunities. You see, the societal emphasis on lineage and family stability meant that offenses affecting these structures, such as infidelity disputes over child custody or perceived threats to fertility, often had more profound legal ramifications, especially for women. A woman's social standing was often deeply connected to her role within the family and her ability to contribute to the lineage. A breach of these expectations could lead to severe social and legal consequences, including ostracism or financial penalties for her family. However, it's crucial to avoid generalizing. The specifics varied enormously between different ethnic groups, kingdoms, and even villages. In some matrilineal societies where inheritance and lineage were traced through the mother, women might have enjoyed greater legal protections and power. In others, patriarchal structures might have limited their direct participation in formal legal proceedings, although their influence through male relatives or informal channels remained significant. So, as you drift into this intricate aspect of history, remember that justice was never a single monolithic entity, but a tapestry woven with countless threads, including the distinct experiences and roles of men and women within their specific social universes. From the nuanced considerations of gender and justice, let's now gently shift our focus to the fascinating and often more lenient treatment of children and legal accountability in medieval West African societies. Unlike modern systems that have distinct juvenile justice frameworks, these communities approached offenses committed by the young with a blend of education, familial responsibility, and a deep understanding of developmental stages. Imagine a system where a child's misstep wasn't just a crime, but a teachable moment for the entire lineage. A mainstream historical fact is that children, particularly those below a certain age of understanding or physical capability, were rarely held to the same strict legal standards as adults. While their actions could still cause harm or disruption, the emphasis was typically on guidance, correction, and restitution orchestrated through their families, rather than formal punishment of the child themselves. For instance, if a young boy stole a piece of fruit, his parents or guardians would be held responsible for making amends to the victim, and the focus would be on teaching the child the importance of honesty and communal respect, often through proverbs, stories, and family discipline. The family absorbed the immediate legal burden, and the community supported the family in the educational one. For a quirky tidbit, in some communities, children involved in minor disputes might be subjected to a form of play trial, where the elders would humorously yet firmly explain the transgression and its societal impact, making the child understand the seriousness without resorting to harsh penalties. Imagine a village elder with a twinkle in their eye playfully scolding a child for taking a neighbor's toy, turning the whole thing into a memorable lesson. Historians still argue whether this softer approach to child offenders was primarily a recognition of their limited capacity for intent, or if it reflected a broader communal philosophy that saw children as future assets whose potential shouldn't be irrevocably damaged by early missteps. Perhaps it was a forward-thinking blend of both, prioritizing long-term integration over short-term retribution. You see, children were considered the future of the lineage and the community. Their proper upbringing and socialization were paramount. Therefore, when a child erred, it was often seen as a reflection on the family's guidance, and the community would rally to support the family in correcting the behavior. The goal was to ensure the child grew up to be a responsible and productive member of society, not to brand them as a criminal for life. This meant that communal pressure and familial authority were often the primary tools for enforcing good behavior among the youth. However, as a child approached adolescence and then adulthood, the expectations and the severity of potential consequences gradually increased. A serious offense committed by an older adolescent might be treated with much greater gravity, though still often with a view towards reintegration if possible. So, as you reflect on the tender age of innocence and its interaction with the law, consider how these societies balanced accountability with the vital need to nurture their youngest members, ensuring that the fabric of the community would be strong for generations to come. It truly highlights a different kind of communal wisdom, doesn't it? From the delicate handling of youthful offenders, we now broaden our gaze to a different category of individual within the legal sphere: foreigners under local law. As trade routes expanded and societies interacted, people from distant lands inevitably found themselves within new jurisdictions, and their encounter with unfamiliar customs and legal systems presented unique challenges. Imagine yourself as a traveler, perhaps a Hausa merchant in the Malian Empire, or a Berber trader in a coastal Akan village, suddenly caught in a legal entanglement far from your own people and familiar laws. A mainstream historical fact is that while indigenous West African legal systems were primarily designed for their own people, they generally extended their authority to foreigners within their territory. However, the application of law to non-locals could be complex. Often, customary law would prevail, but there might be special considerations, particularly in major trading hubs, where established protocols for inter-ethnic or international commerce had developed. The local rulers and elders held ultimate jurisdiction, but prudence often dictated a degree of leniency or diplomatic negotiation when dealing with powerful trading partners or individuals protected by their own influential groups. For a quirky tidbit, in some instances, disputes involving foreigners might be mediated by a designated stranger's friend or a local dignitary who specialized in inter-community relations. This individual would act as an interpreter of both language and custom, helping to bridge the cultural and legal divide. Imagine a professional cultural liaison who's also an expert in both local jurisprudence and the subtle art of negotiation. Historians still argue whether the treatment of foreigners was primarily driven by pragmatic economic considerations, not wanting to disrupt valuable trade relations, or if it reflected a broader philosophical openness to outsiders, albeit within the confines of local authority. Perhaps it was a shrewd balance, welcoming commerce while firmly asserting sovereignty. You see, the arrival of foreigners, whether merchants, scholars, or migrants, brought with it potential for new types of disputes. A theft committed by a foreigner might not just be a crime. It could be an international incident. A contractual disagreement could strain diplomatic ties. Therefore, the resolution of such cases often involved a delicate balance of justice and diplomacy. While a local might face a direct ordeal, a well-connected foreign merchant might find their case resolved through negotiation, arbitration, or the payment of hefty reparations that avoided more severe personal consequences. However, it's important to remember that not all foreigners were treated equally. A powerful Muslim scholar from North Africa might command more respect and a more nuanced legal process than, say, a destitute traveler or a captured individual. The power dynamics between the foreigner's homeland and the local kingdom undoubtedly played a role. So, as you reflect on the presence of outsiders in these ancient lands, consider the intricate dance between local sovereignty, cultural exchange, and the practicalities of maintaining order and fostering trade, when diverse peoples intersected under a single legal sky. From the complexities of foreign interactions, let's now turn to a vital, though often informal, component of any legal system: appeals and higher authority. While medieval West African justice rarely featured a tiered court system like modern judiciaries, mechanisms for reviewing judgments or seeking redress from a higher power certainly existed. Imagine a disgruntled villager feeling wronged by a local decision, seeking out a more powerful chief, a renowned elder from a neighboring clan, or even making a direct appeal to the unseen spirits. A mainstream historical fact is that in many decentralized societies, if a local chief or council of elders made a decision that was widely perceived as unjust, or if a party felt unfairly treated, they could often appeal to a higher authority. This usually meant seeking the intervention of a paramount chief, a regional king, or a spiritual leader, whose influence extended beyond the immediate community. Such appeals were not always formal court proceedings. They might involve respectful petitions, the presentation of new evidence, or the remediation of the dispute by a more senior and widely respected figure. The legitimacy of a leader often rested on their reputation for fairness and wisdom. So, hearing appeals was part of maintaining that crucial social capital. For a quirky tidbit in some communities, if all earthly appeals failed, individuals might resort to a spiritual appeal, performing rituals or making offerings to ancestral spirits or deities, hoping for divine intervention to right a perceived wrong. Imagine appealing your case directly to the spirit world, hoping for a sign, an omen, or a reversal of fortune. Historians still argue whether these spiritual appeals were primarily a psychological coping mechanism for those who felt powerless, or if they sometimes led to genuine reconsideration of cases by earthly authorities who feared divine wrath or social unrest if an injustice was left unaddressed. Perhaps it was a powerful blend of human conviction and spiritual apprehension. You see, while the justice system might have appeared decentralized, there was often an underlying hierarchy of influence. A village elder's decision could be challenged by appealing to a regional chief, and a regional chief's decision might in theory be brought before the emperor of a larger empire like Mali or Songhai. However, such appeals were often costly, time-consuming, and relied heavily on the personal influence and connections of the appealing party. It wasn't a right to appeal so much as an opportunity for remediation at a higher level driven by social and political dynamics. The very concept of justice in these societies was deeply intertwined with social harmony. A widely perceived injustice could fester, leading to internal strife, feuds between families, or even rebellion. Therefore, mechanisms for appeal, even informal ones, served as crucial safety valves, allowing for the re-evaluation of decisions and the reinforcement of collective trust in the system, even if the system itself was largely unwritten. So as you reflect on the avenues for redress, consider how these communities without the benefit of formal court hierarchies still found ways to strive for equity and prevent enduring grievances from tearing at the communal fabric. From the intricate layers of appeal, we now arrive at the legacy of indigenous justice, a crucial understanding of how these peculiar punishments and profound legal philosophies echo through time and continue to shape the very fabric of West African societies, even into the modern era. Imagine these ancient principles once administered by elders and chiefs under the shade of a baobab tree, subtly influencing contemporary legal practices and social norms in ways you might not immediately perceive. A mainstream historical fact is that despite centuries of colonial rule and the imposition of European legal systems, many customary laws and traditional methods of dispute resolution have persisted and continue to operate, particularly at the local level, parallel to or in conjunction with formal state laws. This is often referred to as legal pluralism, where multiple legal systems coexist. You might find a local community still resorting to elder mediation for family disputes or property disagreements, even while a national court system exists for more serious crimes. The resilience of these indigenous systems speaks volumes about their deep cultural roots and their effectiveness in maintaining local social cohesion. For a quirky tidbit, in some modern West African nations, traditional leaders who once presided over trials by ordeal or communal sentencing are still officially recognized by the state as legitimate arbiters of local justice, especially in rural areas. They may not administer poison anymore, but their moral authority and their ability to mediate and enforce community norms remain powerful. Imagine a government official consulting with a chief whose lineage has been resolving disputes for hundreds of years. Historians still argue whether the persistence of customary law is a sign of resistance to colonial imposition, a pragmatic adaptation to local needs, or a continued preference for a more culturally resonant form of justice? Perhaps it's a dynamic interplay of all these factors ensuring that the ancient ways are not entirely lost. You see, the concepts we've explored, the emphasis on communal harmony, restitution over retribution. The role of spiritual beliefs and the power of social pressure are not merely relics of the past. They are living principles that continue to inform how people resolve conflicts, understand justice, and interact with authority in many parts of West Africa today. While the most peculiar punishments like the crocodile ordeal or widespread poison trials have largely faded, thank goodness the underlying philosophy of collective responsibility and restoring balance often remains. This enduring legacy also highlights the adaptability of West African societies. They absorbed external influences like Islamic law and later European legal codes, often blending them with existing traditions rather than completely abandoning their own. It created a rich tapestry of legal thought, demonstrating a remarkable capacity to integrate and innovate while retaining core cultural values. So as you reflect on the long arc of justice, consider how these ancient roots continue to nourish the present, demonstrating that history is never truly static, but a dynamic force shaping our world, even as you drift deeper into sleep. Now, as our journey through the peculiar punishments of medieval West Africa draws to a close, let's allow the final echoes of this fascinating history to gently fade, leaving you with a sense of understanding, perhaps a touch of wonder, and hopefully, a growing wave of profound sleepiness. We've ventured through a world where justice was visceral, deeply spiritual, and inextricably linked to the very survival of the community. From the chilling tension of the poison ordeal to the profound social wound of exile, you've witnessed a legal landscape far removed from your own, yet filled with human ingenuity and a relentless pursuit of order. A mainstream historical fact that brings our journey to a soothing close is the universal human desire for justice, which manifests in countless ways across cultures and centuries. Whether through hot irons or community mediation, the underlying impulse to right wrongs, to maintain harmony, and to ensure accountability is a thread that connects us all. It reminds you that while the methods might differ wildly, the core challenges of human coexistence remain remarkably consistent. For a quirky tidbit to leave you with, consider how the collective memory of these peculiar practices might still subtly inform local folklore or cautionary tales passed down through generations, even if the practices themselves are long gone. Imagine a grandmother whispering stories of a sasswood test, not as a historical fact, but as a mythical warning against deceit, a ghostly echo in the night. Historians still argue whether the lingering oral traditions of these practices serve as mere historical markers, as ethical parables, or if they continue to exert a subconscious influence on contemporary moral frameworks and dispute resolution in a region that has seen so much transformation. Perhaps it's a silent current running just beneath the surface of modern life. You've witnessed a world where the lines between the sacred and the secular were beautifully blurred, where the elements themselves could deliver a verdict, and where the community was the ultimate judge and jury. You've seen how justice was not a cold, impersonal decree, but a dynamic, often terrifying process, aimed at healing the social body, making reparations, and re-establishing the delicate balance that allowed these vibrant societies to flourish. It truly puts a modern traffic ticket into perspective, doesn't it? So as you slowly drift away, let these images soften, becoming mere shadows on the edges of your awareness. The ancient river, the crackle of a distant fire, the hushed whispers of elders making a weighty decision, they are now just gentle murmurs in the quiet expanse of your mind. The complexities of customary law, the nuanced roles of chiefs, the subtle impacts of trade and new faiths, all recede into the peaceful darkness. There's no more to analyze, no more to comprehend, just a gentle winding down. Let the strange and wonderful history of West African justice ease you into a deep, untroubled slumber, where even the most peculiar punishments are now just forgotten echoes in the vast library of the past. The stories have been told, the journey is complete, and the weight of the world lifts, leaving only the quiet peace of the night.